One of the main criticisms of my previous video was that I didn't account for all of the hidden costs that are included with the carbon tax. Milk and eggs and most of our meat products are almost entirely exempt from the carbon tax. Let's figure out how much we're actually paying for the carbon tax by first going over Tombe's assessment in more detail. Then we're going to do a little overview on how the carbon tax exemptions actually work. And then finally, I'll give you a life cycle carbon emissions analysis example. This way we can get rid of some of the arguments that I've seen on my previous video talking about how I was missing certain emissions. So in Tombe's assessment, he reviewed the CPI data from Stats Canada and compared it to product prices. This way you can remove the indirect costs and then just look at the direct costs. Then what he did was return the indirect costs into the assessment slowly so that you could see what the effect of the actual carbon tax was. His analysis showed a very low impact on inflation due to the carbon tax, which we reviewed in the previous video, and much more of those increases were actually due to global energy issues, oil prices, and supply chain concerns. The carbon tax effects that he estimated on inflation were 0.6%, and only about 0.3% on foods, as we discussed in the previous video. Here you can see a chart that I built to show this relationship. This is the oil price versus CPI and carbon tax. CPI is measured on the left-hand axis, while oil price and the carbon tax are measured on the right-hand axis. All of this data is between January 2015 and October 2023. You can see that since the carbon tax is applied in April every year, it creeps up and then is static for the rest of the year. If you expected a dramatic effect on consumer prices, you would see a large jump when the new carbon tax gets implemented. But as you can see here, we don't really see a direct relationship with that. And we do see some relationship with the cost of oil, but obviously there's a number of other factors that are going to be involved in the CPI estimate. We have the same chart as that one, but with energy prices. And you can see that energy prices are very volatile, especially in the last year or two. This is where Tombe showed that the decreases in overall CPI and inflation rates were largely driven by the energy price, not by the carbon tax. That's why we see a large reduction in inflation, albeit the inflation rate is still positive, it's just not 8% anymore. Now with that out of the way, we can look at some examples and see if we derive the right order of magnitude on Tombe's assessment. Obviously, he's going to be able to do a lot more than I can. He has better tools, better software, and a better knowledge base within this area. But I should be able to get some relatively close assessment. One of the main criticisms of my previous video was that I didn't account for all of the hidden costs that are included with the carbon tax. These are things like how much carbon does it take to produce oil, or the industries that surround these other systems. So that's fine. Let's use this data that I have here to show the life cycle carbon emissions. This gives the total emissions that you would see for the lifespan of different food products. You can see that the data is split out into its different increments. That's land use or farms, animal feed, processing, transportation, retail, packaging. This is a good time to mention how carbon tax exemptions actually work here in Canada. Many of the industries here in Canada actually have a number of exemptions on their carbon taxing rates, as you can see in this chart. But farming alone gets some of the most exemptions in all of Canada. Here in Alberta, about 91% of it. So now when we look at this chart here, we can see the total number of emissions for each of these food groups that are actually accountable by farming. When you see that beef is 97% of its emissions come from farming, nearly all of which are going to be exempt. Milk and eggs and most of our meat products are almost entirely exempt from the carbon tax. And most of the fruits and vegetables are at least 50 to 60% exempt or more. So those hidden costs really start to go down quite a lot when you see charts like this. Some other important terms here are marginal and average costs of carbon. Marginal costs are going to be the $65 per ton, where average cost is the cost on the total amount of emissions that we have divided by the amount actually paid. So if you're a farm and you're only paying on 10% of your emissions, that 10% is going to get divided over the other 100% of your emissions to give you the average. This is similar to how marginal and average tax rates work here in Canada. In practice, this means that many large emitters are allowed to produce a certain amount of emissions before the tax kicks in. For instance, large emitters in Alberta might only be paying 13% of the actual tax rate, the actual marginal tax rate. To better illustrate this example, let's use the Genesse generating station coal plant here in Alberta. The total facility has about 1,400 megawatts of installed power, which is approximately split between natural gas and coal 50-50. From what I could find, the exemptions on coal are about 800 tons per gigawatt hour, and for natural gas, it's about 370 tons per gigawatt hour. When we compare how much CO2 is produced by a natural gas plant and a coal plant, the emissions are going to be about 24% on the coal plant and about 13% on the natural gas plant, aligned with those numbers from before. So I'm happy to use these for the analysis. The coal plant produces 58% more CO2, resulting in a $12.4 per ton average and then $7.3 per ton average for natural gas. Again, well aligned with the previous analysis. I don't want to give a bad impression of this plant. They're currently working on installing a 95% carbon capture technology. So if we were to remove the exemptions completely, you can see that the tax savings for the coal plant would be about 50 million, and the tax savings for the natural gas plant would be about 9 million. The Genesse coal plant also plans on moving to 100% natural gas, which would further improve the savings and reduce the carbon emissions. In the 2030 case, this energy facility would be saving about $45 million per year on carbon taxes, compared to today, while also receiving no emission exemptions. With that said, carbon capture is still quite expensive and would likely exceed the original costs that we're seeing today. This is why solar and wind are still the best options for new facilities, while natural gas facilities with carbon capture are a good intermediate step to tack on to existing plants until we have sufficient battery and renewable penetration. Now that we know how exemptions work, let's look at our life cycle CO2 emissions analysis. For each of our goods, you can see the total extra price you would pay just in the carbon tax due to the life cycle emissions. That's $6.50 a kilo for beef, but only 3 cents a kilo for something like apples, which would be akin to my peach example from the previous video. Now look what happens when we exempt 90% of the farm emissions. The meats see a drastic reduction in their costs, beef down to 82 cents a kilo, and apples drop to 1 cent a kilo. With this in mind, my peach example may have been an over-exaggeration of the cost, not an under-exaggeration. In order to better compare this to Tombe's analysis, let's take the average per capita consumption of food in Canada, shown here, and then apply it to what these costs are. This is what happens when we impose the last two graphs onto the Statistia chart. We get the total kilos of food consumed on the left-hand side, and then the right-hand axis shows the total cost. When farming is removed, which it should be for this type of analysis, you can see a dramatic reduction in costs. I had to make a few assumptions on things like pet food and convenience food, so if you do the analysis, you might get a little bit of a different result, but it should be pretty close. Obviously, meat is the biggest contributor of CO2 emissions, largely driven by beef. Luckily, there are ways to reduce the CO2 emissions of beef substantially, but if you're Danielle Smith, you're just going to fearmonger people into thinking that all chemicals are bad. Finally, we can put this all into table form and add a few more columns. The first column is the orange line from the previous graph. The second column is the gray line from the previous graph. The third column is the same as the first column, but instead of using $65 a ton, we use the average carbon price of $12.4 per ton. And the final column is the same thing, but again, removing 90% of the farm emissions. We can compare all of this to the average per capita grocery costs of about $39,000 per person per year. The absolute worst case, though we know it's not true, would be an increase of 8.2%. That would be since 2019. Whereas the more reasonable case, aligned with what I was doing, is about 1.6%, again, since 2019. The average cost case is about the same as the second case. And then in our final example, because we know there's lots of farm exemptions, we know there's lots of industry exemptions, but we don't know 100% how that's oriented, actually gives us the value that Tombe came up with. I'm happy with this analysis because it gives us the right order of magnitude, and we're pretty close to the analysis that he came up with using much more sophisticated methodologies. So with this analysis, it would suggest that the increase in price per capita would be anywhere from $12 a year to $63 a year. The average person in Alberta gets back $772 per year. I appreciate you taking the time to watch my videos. If you'd like to see the previous video that I was referencing, it should show up on the screen now. If you're interested on some of the mechanics of climate change, Potholer 54's videos are really good. I plan on making more videos in the future, so let me know down in the comments if there's more things that you would like to see. Thank you.